Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon to some of you. My name is Tim Cusick. I'm the WKO4 TrainingPeaks product leader, and I'll be taking you through the webinar today. I still see a lot of people rolling in, but I just wanted to get started here and try to keep us generally on schedule. Today's webinar is about building fatigue resistance. This was a pretty tough webinar to prepare. I did do it last night for a large group, and we have another very large group here today. Want to make sure that everybody understands this webinar is a little bit different. I don't get too technical into charts and stuff like that. There's been so much discussion about this idea of fatigue resistance, and I know you've seen myself and Andy and some other people talking about it. This is more a philosophy, an education, a tool in coaching. So the reality is we'll go through it the same way. I've got a pretty good overview hopefully for everybody, and I'm going to, as always, try to give you some insights and thinking into it. Great. Looks like everybody can hear me and going fine. People are to learn to tell me they can hear me already. I love it. All right. Excuse me. Snuck in a little mountain bike ride in the freezing cold over lunch and still haven't cleared it totally out of my chest. So as we go today, as most of you already know, I'm just looking at who's on the webinar. It looks like we're pretty much got everybody coming in now. Easy enough to ask questions as we go. Most of you have this little small tab on the right-hand side of your screen. You can open and close the control panel of the GoToMeeting by clicking on the orange arrow. And then one of the options that you have are questions. You can enter a question at any given time right here. I'm watching the questions on a second screen, and I tend to answer them as I go. I really don't like, as I always say, I don't like coming back like 45 minutes later to a question you asked and you've already forgotten why you asked it. I tend to blend them right into the presentation so it doesn't interrupt, like let me answer all these questions. Sometimes I do interrupt if the question's just unique enough and gets that. And sometimes I'll just say I'll get to you because I know it's coming in the presentation. I really like the questions as we go, so don't be afraid to ask them. And I'll try to get to as many as we can. In tonight's presentation, don't forget that this is my opinion. I always say this in the, up front of all the webinars. The reality is I do have some experience both in the software and the coaching side. I've been doing this for a long time. I do avoid kind of line in the sand style thinking. So everything I'm presenting here really is my opinion. I hope that people take a look at it, use their knowledge and analytics in WKO4 to either validate or invalidate how it might work for you. So everything we're seeing here really is my opinion. When you start talking about fatigue resistance, just to put this note up front also, you really have something that's very broad. When you start talking about fatigue as a whole, something that's very scientifically broad. We're still not even 100% sure what causes fatigue. We have a bunch of factors and things like that, but we don't really have it nailed down into exactly what it is. So when I use science, I'm going to simplify and use high-level science. Problem is with that much diversity, if you try to be overly specific, it always ends up in some type of scientific argument. I'm not an exercise physiologist. I can point you at some good ones, so we'll pretty much play it at that. All right, let's jump in. It looks like we got a lot of attendees. Okay, before we even start, I want to teach you a valuable lesson about fatigue resistance. And the reality is this might be one of the most important lessons that you get in this next hour. And this is something you can actually do with your athletes. It would be an interesting test. This was a test done by two Italian exercise physiologists, Marcora and Staniano. Pretty interesting test, and it just fits this example really well. He basically took 10 people, 10 men, male cyclists, and not like highly competitive cyclists, and they wanted to test fatigue and get a little better understanding. So they did this test, and they basically brought them in at some given point, and they said, okay, here's some watt bikes they did them on and said, you're going to ride, and we're going to do some power testing. So first they did maximal power test. They just wanted to see how much power these 10 guys could put out. So they did it 3 times 5 seconds with some good rest in between. Then they chilled for a little while and relaxed and kind of got ready for the second part. The second part is they rode to exhaustion. And I think in this test, they described exhaustion as couldn't go anymore and cadence was under 50. So pretty much you're fatigued out, right? You can't pedal and they're exhausted and they just quit. And you know, that's what happens. And the reality, these 12 cyclists rode for, it was targeted at 90% of VO2 max, and these 12 cyclists rode an average of 12 minutes at 242 watts. So clearly you're not talking about some highly trained athlete or something like that. You're just talking about 10 average Joes jumping on a bike and riding. The reality is, though, then, as sort of a surprise to these guys, they immediately had them test the 3 times 5 second maximals again, with a little bit of rest in between. And guess what? 9 out of 10 of those had a 30% reduction against the baseline. So 9 out of 10 had a 30% reduction. Pretty much everybody on this meeting right now is probably thinking, yeah, Tim, that's exactly what you would expect. They rode to exhaustion and then they couldn't get that peak power going. But that was 9 out of 10, right? And you had in the mix this guy. Actually, it's better to say that guy, because there's always a that guy. That guy, he did something different. When they asked him to take his 3 times 15 second, when they just jumped on him and said, do it, do 3 times 5 seconds, he had a 90% reduction in power. A 90% reduction in power. So you might be saying, yeah, wow, that guy really blew up. He sucked. He got that wrong. Actually, that guy was the best. And that's the guy I would want to train and be on my team. Here's why, right? Here's the lesson in this. 9 out of 10 people stopped. They rode to exhaustion, but then they could still immediately test within 30% of a peak baseline. Were they really exhausted? This guy, he was really exhausted. And let that sink in, right? And this is something I've literally done this to my athletes. You can test them, and it's kind of a lesson in mental toughness to them if they get the point. We think we're done, right? We think we're exhausted. And the reality is very few athletes can truly go to exhaustion. So when you start talking about fatigue resistance and exhaustion and all these other things, you need to understand that in some way when you look at training, and I know you guys have seen me harp on this in the Facebook group at times, mental toughness is required in cycling. You know, we have basically chosen, I mean, we being all of us, I mean, let's face it, we're dumb, right? We picked a sport that the more that the direct relationship to success is the more you can suffer. Like, that doesn't happen in golf. You know, really, wow, I'm really suffering through this putt. You know, you might have some mental anxiety, but you're not suffering through the putt. The reality is mental toughness. So when you see me talk about fatigue resistance and do the longer test and do this other stuff, trust me, 9 out of 10. The Navy SEALs, Google search 40% Navy SEALs exhaustion, right? And you'll find a bunch of videos. The Navy SEALs run a bunch of tests on this, and they found that when people quit, they're physically typically only 40% done. 40% done. There's actually some pretty good inspirational videos you can send to the athlete that fails this test when you're done. Being able to go deeper is an important part of all of this. All right, let's jump in. Let's start with some definitions. First, let's start talking about fatigue. Fatigue, you can't give one kind of linear definition. It really needs 2 definitions because it plays 2 roles in the way and has 2 different aspects as we utilize it as cyclists and triathletes and endurance athletes. First off, fatigue is an exercise-induced progressive decline in a maximal force of or in maximal force production. So the example is if I jumped on my bike and started pedaling out my driveway and just took off down the road as absolutely hard as I can, I would make a power duration curve, wouldn't I? I'd start out here at, 2200 watts, and then it would be a steady decline down and it would look like a power duration curve. Well, that is the definition of fatigue. It's an exercise-induced progressive decline in maximal force. So I go out as hard as I can. I can't sustain that. I'm dropping off. The second definition is the point when you can no longer maintain a given output of force. So let's say then tomorrow I jump on my bike right out my driveway and I peg it at 242 watts. I might ride down the road for an hour at that amount, but by an hour 3, I'm cracked. I can't go any longer. And that's the point when I can no longer maintain a given output of force. So you have two types of fatigue. One is a relationship of over time, and one is a point in time. The reality as we think about this fatigue and it applies to cycling, you have to think about the two dominant sport conditioning scenarios of cycling in our sport. And it really is short-term intense exercise and extended submaximal training, right? That's pretty much what we're doing. It's one or the other. You can break everything down into those two. So let's think about this example in a power duration curve. So if I start maximal, right, I'm declining. That is one form of fatigue. Or I could pick a point and say, wow, how long could I hold 300 watts? And that would be, out here for about 30 minutes. Those are the two ways we can look at fatigue. The way we tend to break those down, as I just said, is we have short-term intense work, which you typically is somewhere, the time frame is 0 to about 2 to 3 minutes of that. And then everything else is technically prolonged submaximal. There is a little, I don't know if you want to call it an area, I guess you would in here, somewhere between 3 and 8 to 10 minutes that you call max aerobic. Now, typically you would call max aerobic classically. We've called this VO2 max. Like it's been known as a VO2 max training level. Well, the reality is VO2 max is a limiter. The real thing you're training in that training level is your maximum aerobic capability by definition, right? Think about what VO2 max is. So you have this little unique space in there that we'll do some talking about. This fatigue, whether it's the decline in short-term intense fatigue or the maintenance of prolonged fatigue, really has two factors to it. You have to think about it. It really has three. Never forget the psychological. I'll say it 3 or 4 times in this presentation, right? That's the umbrella. Most people truly never fatigue. They're not mentally tough enough. So understand everything I say is going to happen under this idea that there's a psychological side. People surrender, they give up, they quit. So where does fatigue occur? And again, I'm going to group some science here for everybody, so just take it with a little bit of grain of salt. So you have two types of fatigue we're going to look at, central or neural fatigue or central nervous system. What's important to know is that's proximal to the motor unit itself. So if you put your muscle fibers and a nerve together, you would put them to call that a motor unit. And really what that is, it's a limitation of the nerve's ability to generate sustained signal. We just can't sustain the signal anymore. If we're fatigued, that nervous system, neural effect, just can't deal with sustaining the signal anymore. This is closely related to the mental toughness. So the desire to quit is a precursor when it's studied to this type of fatigue. Peripheral or metabolic fatigue is the other, and this is residing within the motor unit. And really this one is easy to understand. It's the reduced ability of the muscle fiber to contract. The motor unit itself just fatigues, right? It's tired, doesn't want to do its job. That's simple. What causes fatigue? You'll see, and I put in the handouts this presentation in a PDF format, you will see that I put a longer list of fatigue factors in the end. I just didn't want to open up the door of looking at all the things because it would take forever. But I want to break it down in a little bit of a discussion in two things, because this really is the way cyclists think about things and triathlete. You have the accumulation hypothesis and the depletion hypothesis. Now the reality is fatigue is exercise dependent. It could be one, the other, or both. But understand, just for the sake of giving two different ideas, let's break them down. So the accumulation hypothesis, really there's a buildup of metabolic byproduct in the muscle fiber. Lactic acid or lactate buildup. You could have hydrogen ions, probably everybody here, if you don't, look up the relationship that happens here. Ammonia, inorganic phosphate, there's more, there's other stuff that can happen. We tend to as in the endurance sport world, highly rate lactate as the primary marker associated with accumulation. Like I built up lactate in my muscle and I couldn't go anymore. If you exercise at a high enough intensity, you're actually building hydrogen ions and you accumulate them, and that interferes with the force production. Again, we tend to think this is lactate. It's not. You know, that feeling of the burn, and it's so bad I can't squeeze that, you know, muscle one more time. That's related, but it's actually more happening here. So the accumulation hypothesis, we fatigue because we're building up a bunch of metabolic byproduct. The depletion process, as you would assume, being on the other side, that actually happens itself in two ways. You have a neural depletion. You basically just deplete the chemical released by the nerve cells that send those signals. So you're just using that reality. You've just used up that chemical and you're not repleting it fast enough. And then you have the depletion of energy substrates or fuel. So basically you can run out of ATP, creatine phosphagen depletion, glycogen starts already being sucked down to replace ATP and CP. Basically you run out of fuel. So depletion is pretty easy to understand, right? You're running out of the chemical that drives that controls the engine, and the engine's just chewing through all the food and it's depleting. What types of fatigue? Well, if you think about that short-term intense and prolonged submaximal we talked about, and here you see the accumulation and depletion overlap, exactly as I said would happen. So in the short-term intense, you're really going at decrease ATP. These probably are out of order just in the sense of the way you might think about it. So you decrease in ATP, you have a decrease in ATP, your creatine phosphate depletion, you accumulate lactate, you have a proton, the hydrogen factor that we're talking about, accumulation, and you have this decrease in neuromuscular activity, some chemical, some fatigue. Under prolonged submaximal, you actually have a decrease in blood sugar, a decrease in muscle glycogen. You know, I included dehydration because you see it in so many of the studies and things like that, but I'm skeptical, and I know more research is being done these days on the effects of dehydration. Hyperthermia, the reality of how you put off heat when you burn calories, that heat has an effect on your ability to not fatigue or creates fatigue. And then you just simply have lactate accumulation as a certain reality here. So here we have a list of items that it can be. So therefore, you have to ask, what is fatigue resistance? So fatigue resistance, I think I've pretty much gotten to all the questions as I was going through. Keep them coming, those are good ones. So fatigue resistance, if we have two definitions of fatigue, we need two definitions of fatigue resistance. First was to resist or slow the rate of exercise-induced progressive decline in maximal force production, right? I don't want that curve to drop off like it does. I want to be able to sustain more of the curve. I want to raise it and keep it going. Or two, I have the ability to delay or extend the point when you can no longer maintain a given output of force. So in my second example, I leave the driveway at 242 watts. I want to be able to maintain that for 90 minutes instead of fatiguing out at an hour. So fatigue resistance really is that simple, and it goes to what a lot of you have heard me say before, and you can see in the individualizing webinars and in the training of PMAX, FRC, FTP, and stamina, you have this idea of raising the curve and extending the curve to the right when you're talking about the power duration curve. So now that we have some understanding of what the basic definitions are, what do we do with this knowledge, right? How do we use it? So the reality is you're using this, and remember I said this is kind of a philosophy. It's like fatigue resistance, we can measure it in a lot of ways. We can, now that we have the ability to have a power duration curve and intersection points and curve over curves and stuff like that, but using it still is philosophical. It still is, as a coach, it's something that you should consider in a lot of ways and understand the theory, the thinking of building fatigue resistance is tool number one. Just understanding that this can be out there. Because one of the other soapboxes that I get on is that because we've broken so many things down into easier to do efforts, we've kind of created this, what I call the 20-minute revolution. And we do everything in under 20 minutes. Every submaximal interval seems to be done in 20 minutes. I mean, 2 times 20 SST. Every FTP test, 20 minutes, or less. Everything happens in under 20 minutes. The philosophy, to me, I actually think that's hurting cycling as a whole, or the performance of cyclists and coaches as a whole. The reality is we've done away with the longer effort, which is holding us back both psychologically. We're learning not to suffer more than 20 minutes, and physiologically. And I think if you say, what's the first tool? Engage in the idea that it's not just about more watts. Power training, the 20-minute revolution, we've so focused on 1 more watt. I would much rather have somebody with a greater fatigue resistance versus 5 watts. And we'll talk about that here, in a little bit. So how do you improve the odds of fatigue resistance? Here's an interesting note, right? And then I'm going to give you a little example. So you've heard me say it, and you've heard Andy say it, and it absolutely is true whenever we look at the data. Functional threshold power is the single greatest factor related to performance success in endurance sports. But lack of fatigue resistance is the greatest factor in performance failure. I see it all the time. People who just for years try racing or timed performance, TT kind of events or other things, and they fail to meet their goals and objectives, or they fail to finish with the pack, or they can't win the race. When you really look at it, fatigue resistance is often a bigger factor than is observed or is observed at the time. So think about it, right? We all have like a Wednesday night Worlds or a Tuesday night throwdown or a Saturday morning, roundup, where basically you and somewhere between 10 and 100 of your semi-acquaintances show up at a parking lot. Everybody's friendly. They say, okay, let's roll out. You're doing 26 miles an hour. 8 seconds later, everybody's, pinned and going hard. Well, that group leaves, right? And you all generally tend to stay together for at least the first 10 to 15 minutes. And then you tend to start thinning the herd at that given point. And by 20 to 25, usually 30 at the most, if you think about how most of it plays out, you probably have the same old suspects in that group, and you've whittled it down to a pretty smaller equation. Does that mean half the people that got dropped off the backside, they had the power, right? They were with you the first 15 minutes. They didn't have the fatigue resistance. And don't get me wrong, threshold plays a role in that. You have to have ability and, blah, blah, blah. But if they held with you in 15 minutes, that is the failure came from lack of fatigue resistance. One of the things I go through with all of my athletes is I ask them to tell me in the initial interview is, how do you win? How do you win races? And I want them to be able to articulate it in a way that puts a vision in my mind's eye about it. Like, wow, that's very cool. That, is important. Then when they're all hepped up and they're explaining that, then I say, how do you lose? You really want to learn a lot about your athlete and their perception of things. Ask them how they lose. And you get a lot of that. And you'll see so many times what they're really describing as fatigue resistance. So let's talk about the fatigue resistance strategy, how this thinking, philosophy, whatever you want to call it, can be utilized for you. One, you need to add it to your annual training plan thinking. I'm going to give examples of each of these, by the way. You need to utilize understanding of it to build better training tactics and workouts, which is one of the things I really see cool in the Facebook group now. We're really starting to build some better workouts. I'm going to do some paradigm breaking here in a little bit, so everybody be warned. Motivate athletes in a carrot and a stick fashion that is not just more power. So what I mean by carrot and stick is you can show them at what point they're declining, at what, an intersection point on a power duration curve, a TTE, something like that. The reality is you can actually get them to understand why you're trying to push it out, and then actually use time and measurement to motivate them. And sometimes that's a carrot, sometimes it's a stick. A lot of athletes are motivated by a data-driven target. And finally, improving the ability to stack, my word, which I will explain, periodized training. The more you train, the more you can train. And this is something funny. So let's start talking about stacked periodization. I'm going to work back through this group. All right, stacked present. When we start talking about annual training, right, when we have this periodization, linear periodization probably is the most used type of periodization in endurance sports. I'm just giving a simple example showing base, build, race, 3 cycles of a periodized plan. What happens a lot of times is an athlete decides they're going to improve their performance. And in their desire to improve their performance, they create more. And it's funny, what they do and what we tend to see, or what I tend to see all the time, is they create more time. So they spend more time in base, more time in build. And whenever I give that example, I always get the response back from a coach. And you bet you're thinking it right in your head right now, a lot of you are. Well, my athlete only has 12 hours a week to train, or 10, or 8, or 12 and a half. 98% of all our athletes, 99%, have jobs and careers, and they work, and they don't have a tremendous amount of training time. So how do they add more? Well, what they do is they extend the cycles. This is why I said think about it in your annual training plan. So 12 weeks of base, what they might have really been thinking, 12 weeks, well, wow, I just do a bunch more base. So 12 becomes 20 weeks. Just more base, because you're capped out at your 10 hours, 12 hours, right? So the only way you're going to get better is to do more of that base training. And then when you get to build, who knows, for somebody, 6 becomes 12 weeks. We're starting earlier and earlier every year on our annual plan because we're extending out. And then you race, and when you race, you really end up with no increase in peak, even though you've trained longer, right? This happens all the time. And if you've watched some of my other webinars or at the innovation conference where it was funny that it literally became a language of the weekend, this is what happens when you become permafit and you never really peak. You just drive up your CTL to some level because you have 10, 12 hours a week to train, and then you're just bouncing along at that same level. Well, if you want to stack periodization and you start thinking about fatigue resistance building, it's a little different. So first you need to start thinking about more. Again, you're coming base leads to build leads to race, right? So you want to start this thinking with base. You need to start thinking about more time in zone. Now that's not the same zone for each one of these, right? You're doing different type of work, but time in zone starts becoming really important when you start thinking about fatigue resistance. So the reality is the way we extend and make a better pyramid is we improve this base. So if we do a better job of base and we build a deeper aerobic base, the reality is that's the secret to building a higher race peak, not what was on the slide before, because here's what you end up doing. So, and you can steal this, I stole this from somebody, I can't even remember where, but this is exactly a reason to explain better base building to your athlete. Because the reality is the deeper aerobic base, it's an aerobic sport, damn it. I know you've all seen Andy say that a bunch of times, and he's right. The deeper that aerobic base, the more work you can do and build. So think about what I'm talking about by stacking. The deeper the aerobic base, the more work I can do and build, raising performance during that time period. That's what truly leads to being able to race better. So it's a stacking theory. Better fatigue resistance in my base it's going to help me in my racing, but the way it helps me in my racing first is it allows me to do more work in this phase when I get to higher intensities, which drives my performance higher. And if you've watched the webinar I did on building FTP and stamina, where I was given the house example, here you're becoming as tall as you can, your aerobic, fatigue resistance taller in your house. Here you're raising the ceiling and then growing up underneath the new ceiling height again. And then here, I never fixed this typo. Sorry about this one. There's a typo in this. That's what somebody was teasing me about in the Facebook. Physiologically and psychologically, you're more prepared to race. you're also more tactically prepared. So by learning to go hard longer, learning to go hard deeper and more, right, you're much better prepared for success here, physiologically and psychologically. And tactically prepared, what I mean by that, the number of times I've seen somebody get into cycling racing and become a Cat 5 racer, race, I don't even know what it is, 10 races that they have to do, and immediately Cat up to Cat 4, then do enough Cat 4 races without ever breaking the top 20 that they get the points to upgrade, or not ever breaking the top 10, they get the points to upgrade, and they upgrade to Cat 3. And then you start talking to them about race tactics, and the reality is they're not fit enough, they're not capable enough to actually implement tactics. They've only been, they've gotten all the way to Cat 4 or Cat 3 because they've just kind of followed along. And whereas they might be thinking about race tactics, when you are on the rivet and your tongue's hanging out, you don't implement tactics very often. You might make one move, one thing, but you're not really being tactical. So this type of thinking gives you better opportunities for success. And triathlete performance, same reality if you think about it. Obviously you can use this in all your training philosophies, and I'll touch on triathlete a little bit here and there. So let's break this down by its periods, right? So if you were to take those same 3 periods, and again, everybody, my opinion, and Derek, I do see your question, I'm getting to it. These are, some of the focus. There's not more, this isn't my comprehensive process towards annual planning or something like that, but I am trying to give this thinking of fatigue resistance and where it fits in for you. So let's just take your base build race period. I don't like, for me, the base is 12 to 16 weeks. Most experienced athletes who haven't lost too much fitness, 12 weeks is fine, 16 weeks when needed. If you're doing base building more than 16 weeks, to me, you're just going towards that permafit direction. You're not really doing it. It's just too much work for low gain. During this time period, we have a progression of things. So we're working on aerobic endurance when we start the base, then we're moving up to aerobic power, then we're moving to max aerobic. The reality is when we get to the build, and it's never this clean, you guys, it's always overlapping. You have limiters and some reasons you might be doing anaerobic work in here and this and that. I'm just trying to give the example of the progression here. When we get into the build, you're starting anaerobic endurance and then building up to anaerobic power. So the reality is, I would say there's certainly a large chunk of coaches who would say, I have this backwards. They want to build power first and then the ability to extend it. I like building the endurance first because I find I can do more high power output once I have some endurance underneath me, and I think that results in a better result. And then race, you just go win. You're working on speed work and you win. If you start thinking about this idea of fatigue resistance, if you remember my extensive and intensive philosophies, you're basically starting out with fatigue resistance, doing extensive work, and it's a pretty linear line. I don't care who you are, what your weaknesses and limiters are, what your strengths are, but it's a pretty linear line to evolving into more and more intensive aerobic work. When you do the build, right, the same idea, you're going extensive to intensive, you're going, fatigue resistance to power, but it's not always linear. Sometimes it is, but here in this area is really where the demand of the event and the ability of the rider, you might take a more undulating approach towards doing it, mixing and matching. If they have some real limiters here, you might be going after intensive right off the bat because the athlete needs more work there. So you really have the art of coaching and how you utilize these tools playing more of a role here. Breaking down the base period a little bit further, it really is the building blocks of more. Think about my stacking example, right? You have these building blocks of more you're building on. You're maximize your duration during this phase. If you can squeeze another hour or two out of your athlete, take it. This is the time, the base is the time to get people doing a little bit more if they can find a way. But really it's driven by this maximize your disciplined time and zone. I'm going to give examples of this in a minute. Progression principle driven by time and zone. I'm going to talk about that here in a second. And what that means, well, actually, let's just talk about it. Progression in time and zone is the driver, meaning if you can do 2 times 20 and the athlete is doing those, does that well, and I'm going to go into specifics on this. The athlete right now, and this is what I call the 20-minute revolution, right, which I'm against to some degree, is the next step isn't just add more power, right? We tend to want to just always add more power, and we push ourselves and we're trying to get the maximum number at 20 minutes. In this phase with my athletes, I literally say to them, don't go over the power. Here's your control, blah, blah, blah. If you're feeling really good, go longer. So we get so wrapped up, we're always thinking more and more and more. Go, extend time in zone, because that's the progression driver. You, as a coach, always need to be overreaching and driving, performance. You need to overreach almost every workout if you want adaptation to continually occur. That's the progression principle. It's part of the progression principle. So you want to drive that in this base period by time. Get people thinking time, not power. Not that power is important, but I'll give you an example. This work happens in this areas of our chart. You could see in our little chart, it's right there: aerobic endurance, extensive, aerobic power, intensive, and max aerobic power. How does that break down a little bit in this base period? Well, at the core, duration is king. If you're just building aerobic endurance, duration is king. If you were a pro, there is plenty of benefit from riding around for 25 to 30 hours a week at a low endurance power. I know everybody says that doesn't work. It works really well, but it only works when you're a pro and you can put in all those hours, and then you could just chill and recover in all the other hours, and you don't have to deal with kids and family and job and stress. And it doesn't work for long. Like for me with my pros, I will start my first cycle that way, and it is part of the building process. You just have to know and move on to some other stuff. When you start building aerobic power, tempo, SST, and FTP work, time and zone, that's king. That's your core focus. I'm going to give examples. And when you get to max aerobic, we're going to talk about max aerobic and building VO2 max. So the focus, when you're doing aerobic endurance, a tip for everybody: if you have an athlete, we all have this athlete, we all have a bunch of them, I bet. You prescribe endurance and you're saying in the endurance level 2 is 150 watts to 197 watts, right? And they go out and immediately peg it at 196.5 as an average. And no matter what you do, right, they're always right there at the ultimate upper number, whatever you write. Have them target the mid-endurance zone. Going higher, going right to that edge of endurance riding, you're only getting a totally minor, a tiny, tiny little aerobic benefit for riding like that, and you're creating more fatigue. And really good training is about optimal response for the least amount of fatigue. As you move forward, exactly I was talking about, progress time, not power in this phase, and I'm going to give examples. Frequency, I can always do aerobic endurance. Aerobic power, 3 to 5 times a week. It depends what the athlete can withstand and depends what the athlete can withstand and accomplish. So when I'm talking about time and zone, I'm talking typically about average power, but there is a role for normalized power if you're following the TAN workouts. But I'll touch on that also in a moment, but generally it's average power, time and zone. Some workouts you do want to look at when you're doing TAN work, what you are looking at is normalized power. So that's a choice, that's by application of the coach. So if we look at max aerobic, in this phase, you really don't need much, but you shouldn't ignore it. I'd say once, and there's a lot of ways to skin this cat, but once every 7 to 14 workouts. And then you have secondary focuses, or basic, your limiters. So remember what we're talking about here, your progression principle and the base rules. You're building aerobic, the combination of aerobic capability and muscular endurance, that's fatigue resistance building at this point. You're progressing through the training levels, which means you really start at mid-level 2 and then you go to true tempo, true SST, not hidden FTP. Most people ride their tempo like SST and they ride their SST like FTP, but you progress. You build some endurance and you start adding tempo. You get better at tempo, you start adding SST. You get better at SST, you start adding FTP. It's a series of overlapping introductions of work levels. And remember, you're progressing time at the training level as the priority, not the watts. So what does this progression mean? I actually have an example chart like this for tempo, SST, and FTP. I should just built one chart because don't take the numbers as specific, just take the ideas as generalizing these ideas, because I have to use such a broad range of numbers because the amount of tempo a newer cyclist can start out with is not the same amount of tempo somebody with 10 years of racing under their legs can start with. So understand I'm just showing you a broad range and an idea. But this is the idea of progression. So if you start out by 1 times 30, then progress to 2 times 20. Then come back to 1 times 45, then you can go to 2 times 30. Then maybe 1 times 60, 2 times 45, or 1 times 90. So the reality is, why do we break these intervals down? Well, this is kind of funny, right? So if you do, and it's just timely, Andy was posting on it today in the Facebook group. So if you did in tempo 2 times 20 or 1 40-minute steady state effort, is there any different physiological response? And the answer is assuming the 2 times 20 has a short break in between. You know, you're not taking an hour, you're taking a couple of minutes. The answer is no. So why do we so often in zones under threshold break things down into intervals? There's no real difference. I mean, you have a little mitochondrial, contract a little, there's a little bit of an aerobic factor, but as long as you keep that break short, the reality is it's just the psychological. We're making it easier for our athlete. So what we tend to see, and I should have written this as an example, what I see all the time is you start at 1 times 30, right? And this is tempo or SST or anything. You know, not always the same time frames, but so okay, you go to your 2 times 20. Then the next step is typically 3 times 15. And you notice what I wrote, 1 times 45. The only reason you should use the in tempo and SST, break it into intervals like that, is to get the athlete mentally prepared to go to the next step. And this is really important, in my opinion, that you understand what I'm saying. What has occurred is we've used it as the new norm, that we always have to have these little breaks. So all you're really doing, this 2 times 20 is, okay, you're just getting the athlete mentally prepared and a little bit I mean, it's one more workout, right? So you're physiologically preparing them, but it really is more mentally prepared. Then you progress on back to the longer one. What's happened in the 20-minute revolution is we've gotten stuck on this, gotten stuck on breaking, and then 2 times 20 becomes 3 times 15, something becomes 6 times 10, and and then you end up doing an hour of tempo by doing 6 times 10, which it happens all the time. Return back, right? That's something that's so important. When you start thinking about power progresses naturally. It's not driven. Don't get me wrong. It's not like the athlete isn't going to be getting more fit, and that's a result of your testing and other stuff. Just let the power follow. Don't make it the driver. It's still going to go up. You, as you know, one of the things Andy always says is always be pushing. So ABP. So you're naturally going to progress a watt or two every workout, a little bit. I mean, it's not going to keep going, but you get my point. You're going up a little. It's not the driver. Push the time range, and this will start happening. Same example for SST. Tons of ways to skin this cat. I started really short just because somebody might have, athletes that need to start this type of work lower. But 1 times 15 leads to 2 times 20 to 3 times 15 to 2 times 25. See, what I'm always doing is I'm always building back towards the long effort. We need the psychological side, and the physiology is the same. You're only breaking it down to make it easier for them, push them, make them go longer. Central nervous system, the other things adapt to that longer side. And again, the power progresses naturally. And you could choose to do this in all types of different times. Don't take my times and like, oh, his screenshot said go from here to here. Do it how you see fit. But what you notice, instead of progressing more short intervals, I'm making the intervals themselves longer till they get to a maximum. Okay. Same idea here in FTP. I don't have any bubbles or bullets because I think you guys get what I'm saying, right? You do it across everything. Just that's what I'm saying. It's more of a philosophy, right? It's more of a thought and thinking process that you apply and how you might build this work in intervals in each one of these, because it's also a great way to progress time and zone. Question that somebody asked me earlier, and I didn't get to it yet because I wanted to do it here. How quickly do you progress? Really quickly. Most coaches go too slow. And there's only one way to find out what's too quick. Keep trying. If they can't complete or they have a, watch fatigue. If you see if this person does this, it's easier to understand here. If they hit this 2 times 25 and they do them both solid and cadence stays strong and we don't see a drop off of power in the second one, I immediately go to 1 times 50. I at best typically will only repeat this 1 time, meaning I would do 2 times 25 for 2 workouts. And then I'm going on to my next step, whatever it is. Always be pushing. The progression overload principle rules during this phase. And we athletes, because we're using power, we're taught progression is more watts. Progression is time in zone and pushing that curve to the right all base training long. There's no reason to be raising the curve at this stage. Push it to the right. So I think you guys get that point. All right, now I'm going to tackle another paradigm because I get this question all the time on Facebook, and I ended up getting it last night. You're going to ask me it once I talk about what this means. It's on the screen. So now we have these intervals that are max aerobic, right? And you used to call these VO2 max intervals, and you can still call them whatever you want, and they're still generally the same zone. The reality is that they're maximal aerobic efforts. You're limited by VO2 max and maximal aerobic efforts, and the reality is you're going as hard as you can aerobically, looking to get a maximal aerobic gain. There's more to it than that, and it's simple. Now in this, there really isn't much time progression. And I see a lot of coaches make this mistake on VO2 max. VO2 max, if you read all the research, the best gain in maximal aerobic activity is right around 15 minutes and a little more. So I rarely ever prescribe VO2 max work that goes beyond 20 minutes. Because most of the benefit comes at 15. Now I might want to extend it out. I might want to do different things, right? And this is something I have to give Dean Golich credit for. In the years of working with Dean, he has really shaped a lot of my thinking here and has forced me to read reams of research because I think that's all he does, because he's a pretty sharp player. So the reality is it kind of has shaped my thinking. As I've utilized it more, I've seen better results and it's worked for me, my opinion. So here progression is just go harder because the target is max. That's why I remember in my chart before I only had it as max aerobic, because the target is max, right? So I might go 5 times 3, then I progress to 5 times 3 harder. Okay, and if I want to make a really big jump, I might go 5 times 3.5 or 5 times 4 and go harder yet, right? But typically max aerobic, I'm going hard, I'm going in that range, and I want the athlete to go absolutely hard as they can. I don't care about, actually I don't even care if they look at their power meter, but I want them to go as hard as they can in these intervals for at least 15 minutes. At least 15 minutes, which to get 15 minutes of quality work, you probably need about 16 minutes because, we all cheat a little. We roll into an interval, we roll out type of deal, but that's why I say 15 to 20. So it's absolute max. And I knew somebody would ask, right? So I get this question all the time. There's some ideas and some charts out there, like if power drops more than 4%, go home. I personally don't agree with that for any of the intervals we've talked about so far. So as you begin to fatigue, right, and you're going through a certain amount of work, and let's just use these as an example. And let's say you've gotten through the first 3 at whatever power. You're going as hard as you can anyway. without blowing yourself up in the first interval. So just be careful what I'm saying as hard as you can. You're not starting out and holding a 1,000-watt sprint for the first 30 seconds. So you're just kind of pegging along, right? So the reality is, and we find that natural watermark. I mean, everybody in this is done 3 or 4 minute intervals, right? You find your natural, what I can do and do the workout mark and then push a little harder maybe, but you find it. If my power drops from interval 2 to interval 3 more than 4%, you don't go home, because here's what's happening, right? Your RPE is going up because you're fatiguing, right? So your rate of perceived exertion, you're like, crap, this is getting harder. You have a stress and a strain event going on. So stress is an external measurement. Strain is what's happening inside of your body, right? Most people here know that. The stress measurement, what you're measuring with stress, is watts. That's an external measurement, right? It's a visual, it's a measurement, it's a number that's measuring how hard you're pushing on the pedal times how fast you're pushing on the pedal. That's stress. But it doesn't tell you what your body's going through. So what's happening is you're getting a mixed message here. The stress is seemingly like it's going down, right? Because the watts are dropping. You're tired. I can't hit, that 400 watt number anymore. Now I can only do 390 or 380 or 360, whatever that is, right? So the stress seems like it's going down, the measured external number. Internally, your body's still under a crap load of strain. Even though the stress has gone down, it's because you've fatigued. You're actually removing the anaerobic, more and more of the anaerobic contribution from these type of efforts, which I'm going to show you a chart here in a little bit to explain that deeper. So when you're doing max efforts, which are max aerobic, VO2 max is a maximal style effort, you don't go home. You get in at least 15 minutes of work at whatever you got. Now, you're just getting over the flu and you go out and you can't do one, different story. You know what I mean? Don't do it to this like, wow, I'm not even thinking about it. But the reality is max is max. So there's a question. I put it out there. That's my opinion. 2 or 3 quick questions that I got here. I'm just going to tackle them. The reality is, Eric, good question. So I'll type on it. So if you have to maintain max, let's say you're doing these 3 minutes on and 3 minutes off type of deal, or 3 minutes on, 4 minutes off. I much rather have my athlete, is after they've done 3 or 4 and they're really starting to get tired, take an extra minute of rest is not a deal killer. Taking 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe, but taking an extra minute or 2 of rest and then drilling it again, we get so disciplined in this on-off reality and in the prescription of it. The reality is, if I need another minute of rest to keep hitting really my max numbers, take it. As you get more and more fit, you won't need it. The max aerobic effort is important. There's a couple questions I'm going to hold for a little bit because we're going to get to the more intensive stuff in a moment. So here's a guideline for everybody. Note this here. So if you push this, put it on a screen, you can always take all my screenshots. I don't care. I share everything openly, but I don't want people to think this is some study. This is my opinions over watching this over time. I'm sure you guys will agree, disagree, whatever. So when you're doing a workout, what's the total time and zone goal? I broke it up. Rec Century, Cat 3.5, Cat 1.2 Pro. These aren't hard and fixed guidelines. It doesn't mean if I can do 91 minutes of tempo, I'm immediately a Cat 1. I'm just giving you some guidelines when you're thinking about workouts to progress up to. So tempo, a Century rider should be able to, a good rec rider should be able to do 60 minutes of solid tempo, 3.5, 60 to 90, 1.2, 90 to 180 minutes, if not more, really kind of this can blend. And a pro needs to be able to ride 180 minutes plus. Yeah, for some people who see that, like, well, tempo is like an hour of tempo. And it's like, no, Amber Neben can ride 4 hours of tempo. And she needs that for stimulus. I mean, you want to overreach an athlete of that level, you got to overreach, just is what it is. SST total duration up to 45, 45 to 60, 60 to 80, 60 minutes plus at the pro. And the reason I say you see 60 to 80 here and then 60 minute plus, here you really start getting into a lot of specificity in the way the season plays out. I typically never prescribe more than 80 minutes at this level. So, I might do 2 times 40, like Amber and I do a lot of 2 times 40 work because she climbs Palomar in 40 minutes. So it's, which is heartbreaking, by the way. So FTP durations, I'm not going to keep reading them, you get it all. Max aerobic, it's really hard for a rec cyclist to do this. You definitely need some miles and fitness under your legs. And my target's always 15 minutes. You can go 15 to 20. Cat 1, 2, sometimes you want to go a little deeper. And that's part of the, you still do get a trailing gain after 20 minutes, but it's pretty trailing. You would just go harder. There was a question earlier, I was holding for this. Sorry, I'm just looking that up. So the reality is, if you really, I wouldn't extend it much past 20, just go harder. It's a max aerobic effort. When it says, when something really requires high effort, that's what you do. Okay, I think I answered that question, but so here's some intervals. Really hard to give intervals example. A couple of people asked me to post interval examples or workout examples for doing this. When you're talking about tempo and SST and stuff like that, it's just bread and butter work. There really isn't all that much mystery to it. So it's hard to give you some good ones. So I gave you an SST crisscross. I should have gave you TAN to make Will's example. And TAN is just riding your tempo in a more up-down fashion. Attack out of corner, settle in. We always think tempo and SST work has to be steady state. All that steady state can buff off some neuromuscular power and other factors. Target normalized power and do them more up-down. That's perfectly acceptable. But here's a good one. EPD is explosive power development SST intervals. And all this really is a warm-up, right? And then it's 2 times 16-minute EPD SST interval. What an SST interval is, you start with 3 times 12 seconds. So you basically sprint for 12 seconds, then coast for 24, very light pedaling. Sprint for 12 seconds, then coast for 24, very light pedaling. Then sprint for 12 seconds, and then immediately into a 16-minute SST effort. So go back what we were talking about, the accumulation side of fatigue. EPD intervals teach your body to deal with the accumulation much better. And if you think about it, it'll make sense to you what's exactly you're doing here. You're accumulating metabolic, waste, metabolic, whatever you want to, call it. You're building lactate and everything else in there. So you're accumulating it at this stage, and then you're forcing your body to deal with it at a pretty high rate of exercise. So these workouts, you have this, you can download these, so I don't want to go too deep into it. As we move into this build phase, you have the same progression, but remember I said it's not linear. So anaerobic endurance, you're focusing on max, right? And what I mean by max is, what I've learned more and more, the research is pointing this way, is you always have this idea like doing workouts to extend endurance at anaerobic work. So like 1 minute on, 1 minute off, 1 minute on, or 1 minute on, 2 minutes off, but shorter recovery periods. And there is a school and there is good merit to doing them that way. But more and more, targeting the right duration and going really hard and simply driving that FRC battery up is being demonstrated as a more effective way to do it. And that's what optimized intervals is. That's what optimized intervals is or are. And if you think about the intensive and extensive, it's right there, it's laid out, and I'm going to show it in a moment. So same idea across is your focus is FRC, PMC-RC. You can do 1 to 3 times a week in this phase, but that's only if you're disciplined about running a short build phase. The number of people I see run like these ultra long build kind of phase with all this intensity intervals, I would typically I wouldn't go more than 6 weeks of the build phase and adding a lot of intensity. It really depends on what their racing schedule is like and how much they're about to race. And somebody just asked, is there a PDF handout? Yeah, if you open the little gray question box area, there's a handout. It's in the handout thing. And if not, it'll email out to you after the show. But you can download it right from the little panel. Remember the questions panel? One of the options says handouts. I think yours should be working. It's in there. Cool. So these are high intensity ones happen here. And I don't want to overthink this too much because the reality is, right, that's what we did iLevels and optimized levels or optimized intervals for, you know. And there are some really great charts. I know Donnie and a couple of guys kicked down, they put the iLevels and the optimized intervals on a power duration curve, which really gives you excellent visual approach towards how they work. You're evolving extensive to intensive work. I mean, it's generally laying out the best recommendations that we have there. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is your training plan. You just go out and do extensive. I'm talking about adding the philosophy of fatigue resistance to your training process. So it'd be hard to say much more. I mean, really is you're just progressing. The reality is track your FRC. The battery size matters. You know, it's like as that gets larger, you have better fatigue resistance. You're more capable. There is this idea of repeatability, how many matches you can burn. I would encourage you all to look up the research behind matches, right? It's interesting. It really is an efficiency issue and some other stuff, but I think it's more important that you build as a driver FRC higher and higher to give fatigue resistance. Don't get me wrong, there's a function of repeatability and being prepared for it, but I don't think it's exactly what, I see people use this term matches all the time, and I feel like it just burn more matches, but they don't think about what exactly is the fuel in that match and how it's happening. FRC tracking and doing things to build FRC are probably the best bang for your buck in that area. So here's something, I'm going to close on these two slides and open it up to Q&A. And I fell behind in questions, you guys. There was a little phase there where it just buried me. I'm sorry about that, but if I missed your question, you can ask in the end. This is, I should have put the name of the chart in here. It's called FTP contribution. It's in all of your, it's in the chart library. And what this chart is showing you, right, is a couple of things. So the red line is power duration curve, which you're familiar with. The blue line is their FRC, or their anaerobic contribution. So think about fatigue, right? So this is their anaerobic contribution. And this is their aerobic contribution. So as they put out watts, right, how much of that watt is coming from the anaerobic system, or anaerobically, or anaerobic energy, or ATP, CP, you know, phosphagen, lots of ways to look at it. But it's being produced anaerobically, and this is being produced aerobically. Those systems don't function the same. One's more powerful, one's more efficient, blah, blah, blah. Most of you guys probably know that. But this chart gives you excellent insight into watching and understanding. So if you go back to this athlete, his extensive aerobic intervals are right around 48 seconds, and I have this on 50, but look what's about to happen, right? You're basically, and this is how mathematical modeling and predicting human performance really is the next wave. You talk about optimizing an interval. Here's this athlete's anaerobic power and contribution to this. It really starts dropping over. You're stopping a few seconds before you actually are doing more and more of the work aerobically. So you're basically getting the perfect amount of anaerobic work, right? The perfect amount of anaerobic work before your aerobic system is really contributing more and more and more. So if you think about that, if you're doing these type of efforts, intensive and extensive, this way, what you're doing is you're pushing the curve in this area up, which means you're getting greater contribution, right, in this area. Now, the downside of this is when you're pushing one area up, you tend to push the other one down. Somebody asked a question earlier, they tend to observe when threshold goes up, FRC comes down. Yeah, that's true in this time period, because if it's true at any given time period, right? The reality is if you're focused on one area, that's the cost benefit you've seen me talk about. If I do a lot of threshold focus, my FRC is going to drop. If I do a lot of FRC focus, my FTP is going to drop. There is an art to making sure that when you prepare to race, they're both at their highest for what they need to be. But highest isn't always highest. It really depends what type of a race, what type of an athlete, what do you need to win, what are the demands of the event, all of those deals. But my point here is you can really track it. So the answer to the question is right now, if you're doing the base work and you're doing all this fatigue resistance that I just laid out, I would expect my FRC to go down. There's an inverse relationship, but I can really look at it. When we start talking about max aerobic, you can watch, that's what's happening in this transitional phase, right? And this is really important in race performance because the reality is you're still getting some, and even here, like I took 50 seconds, this athlete, all the way dropped down here, still getting 300 some odd watts anaerobically. If I picked 5 minutes, they're probably still getting about 80. But look what happens by 10, you get pretty flat. Your anaerobic side is pretty much not doing much for you this deep out. The ability, so, you're building this green line as tall as possible, right, over time in the base. Then when you get into the build period, this is why I put it, remember we're talking about the build period, you can build this taller on the green. So think about it, because all the red line is, so you could all test this right now, FRC is 323 watts at 50 seconds, right? Aerobic, or the FTP curve, is 254. If you add those together, you get 577 watts. So now think about what I'm saying to you. If you can spend all base making this better, higher, more fatigue resistant, so this person kinks out at like 38 minutes, right? If you carry that out to an hour and raise it, then when you raise this, the red is higher. Your power duration across the board is higher. So if you can really absorb the visual I just said, that's the magic. And you can measure it and track it now. Now, not everybody can create it, and creating it isn't easy, but you can measure it and track it. So there was a question. I'll answer it right here, actually. So here's 2 workouts, and these aren't really hard at all, except I think there's still one. No, I got it. So you can optimize extensive and intensive. All you're really doing is, I'm suggesting a starting number, and then you just follow the extensive targeting goals. Now, people always say, how many should I do? Do as many as you can, right? And you have to find a starting point with your athlete. If your athlete can handle 6 and they fall apart at 7, start with 6, and then progress them to 7, and then progress them to 8. And progress them to 9. The reality is always be pushing, right? Just find where their breaking point is. And you don't want to, kill somebody in the sense you don't want them laying on the side of the road panting. Most people can't go back to the original mental point, right? So push them hard, and if that's what they got, start there, and then start encouraging one more. You don't need to read these a lot. I don't want to read them out loud to you guys. The key is progressing the number of intervals. I get this question a lot. Right? Intensive and extensive, what's the rest period? Yeah, it's full rest. It's long. As a matter of fact, the one thing we might correct in here, I was talking to a couple of Kevin and myself and a couple of people talking about, with a short max sprint, you really don't need that quite much rest. So that one actually could be a little shorter. But these in here, you want long rest because you want that. Remember I was talking about depletion, right? So once you start doing repeats, where did that slide go? You're depleting. I think I had a slide showing it. I hope I didn't lose that slide. Once you're doing repeats and stuff like that, you are depleting. I did. Wow, I'm missing a slide. That's funny. I was cleaning something up and I actually think I deleted it. Well, the reality is once you start doing repeats, you're depleting your, when you do one sprint, right, you deplete ATP. When you do multiple sprints, you start doing, a couple or a little longer, now you're using CP, creatine phosphate. Then if you do sets and reps, like a bunch of intervals, you're actually using a lot of glycogen also, because that's what's replenishing your ATP and CP. So that brings out more fatigue. If you want those systems, that energy side that you're depleting to fully recover so you can go max, you got to do a longer rest. The reality is cyclists hate that longer rest. It drives us all crazy. It drives me crazy. So the reality is, it is what it is. So I'm going to move into Q&A. Somebody asked, why does the interval, the optimized interval, say 1 to 10, 1 to 20, and mine says 7 minutes? It's a typo. That was the other typo. I forgot to fix that one too. So it should say the same ratio that was in there. So yeah, Carson, that's a great question. Carson asked the question, how do you deal with the dilemma that FRC intervals require longer rest to continue with the fact that most road races don't allow you to take that rest? Remember, I'm talking about extending fatigue resistance right now, one tool in your tool bag of coaching, right? And my answer to that is, we believe that mimicking the pattern of the race is the absolute most important thing. I don't think it's unimportant either. So I mix full on these two workouts, let's call it that, right, in that phase, these type of workouts, long rest, super maximals, efforts and stuff like that, with some kind of what I would call that race specific on-off controlled, I tend to use the term lactate stacking intervals. It's an old term. I'm not sure, I think I'm the last person to use it in the world, but it really gets that visual in my mind, like you're stacking, you're building a little more lactate each time as you go in the process. All right, I'm going to answer this question. So basically, when MFTP gets updated because PD curve just got pushed, how do you handle the new TTE is getting lower with your athletes when training for TTE? Do you lower the duration and up the wattage? That's a tough question. It depends on when. The problem with TTE, right? It's simple enough. If you suddenly, you're getting fitter, and then you test because you haven't been testing maybe in between, or people weren't having some new mean maximal powers, and then the watts jump up for 30 days, meaning like you haven't tested anything and then suddenly your FTP jumps up 30 watts. Sorry, suddenly jumps up 30 watts. The TTE is going to shorten. I think most people don't realize this and get the relationship backwards. It doesn't get longer, it shortens. Because the reality is now you have to hold that additional 30 watts longer. So my answer is, don't forget to do your longer testing in the protocol I put out. Typically that's driven because we didn't do the longer testing protocol. If not, if you have done the longer testing protocol and it still has shortened, then I would use the new shortened number and then begin extending that. So you're constantly stepping back up to the PD curve. You're constantly stepping back up because that's your progressive driver. So you don't want them working underpowered or under watts. The reality is, if, it almost is self-fulfilling because they stepped up, and then if they start doing longer workouts just beyond that TTE at that new power level, it should pull the power duration curve up reasonably quickly behind it. So one thing I just wanted to say real quick, I rarely ever sell anything and promote, but this is just such a cool opportunity, and I don't want to put it in the Facebook group because, again, I'd never want to promote, even though it's TrainingPeaks product. I just try to avoid it for everybody to make it just a fair learning game. But the reality is, we are doing a TrainingPeaks University in Mallorca, and we've paired it with a power training camp. So I work for TrainingPeaks and blah, 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 but I coach through Velocious. Velocious is my wife's company. Kevin and I both coach at camps, which really we just go and have fun with everybody at camps. And the reality is, we've decided to put one together because of all the demand and the requests. We're going to do it once in Europe. So in Mallorca, we have the TPU is Saturday, Sunday, March 25th and 26th, followed by a full week of camp in up towards Palencia, up on the north side of the island. The reality is this is the ultimate way to learn. So all the Facebook, and I get a lot of messages behind, everybody wants to go deeper into stuff. This is going to be it. This is deeper. So if you're in Europe, or if you want to come over and ride someplace a little nicer than the snow of the United States or wherever you're from, join us in Europe. We have a TrainingPeaks University. You'll get CEUs, credits, blah, blah, blah. Our campus CEUs and credits. The combination, we're going to do the classroom work. We're going to learn. This is going to be an advanced session. Then each day we're going to go out and do unique riding testing of concepts in power training, then come back, do analytics, and myself and our staff, and we're going to have a couple of pro visits and some pretty cool people that'll be there. We'll be teaching you, and I'll lead all the education, these concepts, how to track them, how to figure them out, how to go deeper. So if you want to spend a week riding your bike and learning a lot, this is the event. We already have a good core group of the Facebook people that you see posts and stuff like that coming. So I'm trying to give all our followers and everything else the opportunity to sign up first. Really great place to ride, really great fun to be done. So again, I'm not a selly kind of guy. It's never my dealio, and I always share and give all my stuff away, as you guys have learned, but just saying that it's there. All right, so now while I was doing that, I saw a bunch more questions, so I'm just going to keep going through. In the library of charts, it's FTP contribution. So if you can't find that chart, the name is FTP contribution. So just search contribution or FTP. At what percentage of duration would you target lactate stacking intervals? All right, Al, you owe me a quarter because you stole my word. 85 to 90%, so you're on it. Yeah, that's an interesting drop-off. So pick that point and start building to it. I would still say 85 to 90%. So I see what your point is, but yeah, so go start with 4, do 5, do 6. You really shouldn't be dropping off at any given time under 85%. You should be able to do that. And if you're doing them now and you haven't been doing that stuff for a while, I wouldn't expect to do many. That's part of the point. You know what I mean? So, and it also depends on time and length what you're doing. Yes, Mallorca has nice hills. Do a camp in Boulder. We have a TPU in the fall, and we'll see what we can put together, some cool stuff on that. During the base period, you talked about time and zone. Do you still try to extend the curve when the athlete's PR heart rate is less than 5%? I think I'll be quite blunt here. I don't see a big role of training with heart rate, so heart rate's just a trailing indicator. I mean, I want my athletes to capture that data so that I can look at it at a very high level. But why would you use the less precise data when you have the actual more precise data available to you? If I didn't have power, it would be, heart rate would be good. Now, don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean the heart rate data is useless in that sense. I look at it overall. It gives insights into aerobic fitness. It gives insights into a lot of things, but the power data is the driver for me. So, sorry. My other point then, Jeff, is I really don't have a good answer for your question because it's just not a system that I work with. Whenever I mean, don't get me wrong, I have HRV, heart rate, and I have all my athletes track it. I just never find the connection I want. It's too variable at times and gets me in scary places. Next question. All right, the question that starts with the at the end of the season, sprint fatigue, email me that. I'll answer you. You know how to get in touch with me. Just send that to me. That's one for a longer discussion. What's the total cost of a week plus TPU in Mallorca? You know what? I don't know. The camp, I think the TPU was it on there? I'm the worst. They don't let me handle details or money or other stuff like that. They keep me as far away. So if you catch the early bird TPU, it's $299. I think the camp is the whole week with room and board and everything is like $1,600. Mallorca's never that expensive as a camp. There's a discount. Crap, I'm not sure I'm supposed to say this, but there's an email out there with a discount that also, if you email me, I'll send you a discount code that's $150 off. And I already think if you go to the TPU site, there's already a discount there. Like if you combine them, I think your total is like, I don't know, it's at least 150 and it could be high as $300 of combining the two off when you do them both. You can email me and I'll make sure I get them to you, Tim at WKO4. I'll make sure I get them, the combined discounts to you. And the idea is, it would be so cool. What I really want to do, my energy for it is, it'd be really cool to get a whole bunch of all the Facebook and people that you see posting and stuff like that all in one camp. I'm also supposed to mention that there's another, Bobby Julick, we do a lot of work with Bobby. He's actually follows our list and stuff like that. We're doing a power camp in May. It's on this same website. If you go to it, it's there for you guys to look at. You'll also find in here some notes on chronic fatigue. I didn't get into it, but it'll give you some insight of what can happen in the presentation and some of the different types of fatigues and things that I was listing for you. So there's a little section I put behind the Q&A because I knew I wouldn't have time, but I wanted you to know it's back there. And I think I've gotten to all questions. If I missed them, I apologize. That was a lot of questions, which is awesome. I love to see people so engaged. But as always, you can post them in the Facebook group. I'm going to immediately post this webinar. I'd say it'd probably be up as long as we can push it up on the YouTube side. It'll probably be up in an hour or two if there's any more questions. All right, everybody. Have a great holidays. Happy holidays to everyone. Enjoy. Don't think about power numbers and stuff like that for the next couple of days. Just have fun with family. And then Monday, we got to start working off all the fat. That's our goal. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming. Talk to you soon.